why have we taken this position that Russia is an existential threat to Europe or the United States? I mean, quite frankly, anybody who makes that assertion, it's evidence-free. I see no evidence that Putin wants anything to do with Western Ukraine. I mean, he feels compelled to do what he's done in the East. He may ultimately, and I think he probably will, his forces will take all of Eastern Ukraine as a security measure in all probability. And that's what's happened in this particular case. No one in the United States was particularly interested in going to war with anyone, certainly not in backing a war against Russia. But we really didn't give Putin and frankly, his government much choice in the matter. Your viewers are certainly aware of the 14,000 people who died in the intervening 8 years before this intervention by the Russians began. Most of those were people living in Donetsk and Luhansk, and the breakaway republics, as they're called, and they were Russians. In addition to that, you had Russian citizens that were second-class citizens inside Ukraine, and they were being subject to this evil behavior of, we used to call it under the Tsar's Russification, now we call it Ukrainianization. This sort of thing had no future. Putin signed the Minsk agreements, and he was encouraged to believe that the Western powers would exert pressure on the Ukrainians to live up to their end of the bargain. All of that failed. We can go much further back. And of course, the largest issue for the Russians, they're certainly concerned about their citizens, was the emergence of this very large, extremely well-equipped, well-trained, powerful Ukrainian army, whose only rationale for existence was to first smash its way into the so-called breakaway republics and eventually reconquer Crimea. Those things are well known. And in fact, the Russians captured plans to that effect as they advanced into eastern Ukraine. It's tragic, but under those circumstances, if we faced something similar in Mexico, I think that we would have behaved very similarly to the Russians. Probably we would have been much harsher and exercised far less discretion with regard to the use of military power, which is our history. So all in all, it was avoidable. All we had to do was stand up and say, Russia has legitimate security interests in eastern Ukraine. All we had to do was tell Ukraine, its government, we will not support you until you guarantee equal rights for all your citizens before the law. These are not hard things to do, and the State Department likes to blow its horn about its advocacy for human rights. Well, there was an opportunity in Ukraine, and they ignored it completely. So the bottom line is, yes, it was avoidable. Yes, it's a tragedy. And I wish we didn't have it, but we've got it now. And I think it's going to get a lot worse, a lot quicker than people realize.
Doug, it seems that, and Ambassador Freeman alluded to this, the security zone, the proximity of foreign forces to your borders, to your country. There seems to be this persuasion among Western elites that Russia, because of its imperial past, is not entitled to a security zone. Russia cannot have a sphere of influence. That is something that is only reserved to Western powers, and especially the United States of America. What's your assessment of this type of thinking, which denies Russia, the basic tenet of any rational foreign and security policy?
Well, first I have to agree with Ambassador Freeman and point out that my Austrian friends are still saddened in disappointment by Maximilian's failure. They thought that they were going to annex Mexico, which would have been a wonderful opportunity for the Austrians because they probably all would have migrated there in time and there wouldn't be anybody left in Austria. But that's another story.
Doug, instead of drugs, you'd be having more Wiener Schnitzel,
That's right. Now, all kidding aside, I don't think it's a question necessarily of a zone. The real question is, why have we taken this position that Russia is an existential threat to Europe or the United States? I mean, quite frankly, anybody who makes that assertion, it's evidence-free. If you go back and look at February, the first few days of the intervention, then look at what happens from March until about July or August, the Russians sent in very few forces. And several people said, oh, well, look at the Russians. They don't have very many forces, do they? Their army is too small, and they don't seem to be very good. Now, I don't agree with the not very good. I understand the constraints under which they operate because Putin took the position, we don't want to kill lots of Ukrainians. These are people just like us. We don't want to do a lot of property damage. We want negotiations. And he thought, wrongly obviously, that he could induce negotiations. Nobody was interested in talking. We don't need to go back over that ground. But that's the first thing. Is it because Russia doesn't qualify as a pristine liberal democracy? Well, if that's the standard, then Ukraine fails miserably and is worse now than it's ever been. Is it because Russia is too corrupt? Well, we've got lots of corruption in lots of countries, even in our own. This is nonsense. So where is the justification for treating Russia in this way? And then secondly, what are Russia's legitimate security interests? And I think you've stated them. They deserve to have a border area or neighbors that are not necessarily postured, organized, and equipped to attack them. That's not unreasonable. And the funny thing is, when all of this began, my friends that I served with at NATO all took the position that neutrality for Ukraine was a gift to the Russians and to Europe. What a wonderful thing. A nice, open, secure country that is neutral, where we can do business, where no one is threatened. The Russians feel safe from us. We feel safe from the Russians. What's the problem? But we know that was rejected out of hand. And as the ambassador pointed out, there has been no diplomacy. Whatever the Russians have said, we've dismissed out of hand. When anyone in their right mind would have taken whatever offer was there and said, thank you very much. On closer inspection, we see some good things. We need time to study it. In the meantime, while we study this, we'd also like to arrange talks. And then you do your horse trading or your discussion privately. There's too much public diplomacy because every congressman, every president wants to stand there, hurl abuse at the foreign enemy or alleged enemy, and somehow or another think he's going to endear himself to the American public. And here's the news. Most Americans could care less what happens in Ukraine. That's the sad truth.
Well, in light of this, and because of Ukraine, the president of the United States was in Ukraine and in Poland, just left a few hours ago, actually, on Air Force One. I want to touch upon my country, Poland's role in this entire conflagration, which has been very important because during the last 48 hours, we've been hearing a lot of commentary coming from people who are very critical, I myself being one of them, of the current government's position that Poland is becoming the second proxy vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine, in the sense that whereas the main thrust of the proxy war, which has been acknowledged by all the major players that it is a proxy war, is Ukraine, that Poland is lining up to be proxy number two. And in light of this, I picked up this quote from the late Edward Gierek, who was the head of the Polish United Workers' Party in the late 70s. So this is a man who dealt with three presidents, in essence, President Nixon, President Ford, and President Carter towards the end of the 70s. He actually hosted President Nixon in 72, just after the visit in China. I think it was 2 months after, in June of 1972. And Gierek, in an interview in 1992, when asked about how newly reborn Poland should deal with the United States, stated the following, I quote, "Believe me, I have talked to 3 American presidents, and I know that for them, we are just pawns on the grand chessboard of world politics." Fairly controversial statement, but I'd like to get both of your thoughts, gentlemen, on that perspective in light of Poland's role in the current proxy war with Russia. Doug, your thoughts?
Well, the Poles are a charming group of people. They have a wonderful history, but much like Americans, they have difficulty learning from it. And Ambassador Freeman has pointed to the singular reality that however great Poland may be, whatever its aspirations are, it is, for better or worse, wedged between two great powers, really great powers, Germany and Russia. Germany and Russia have lots of reasons to cooperate, but that doesn't mean that Germany or Russia necessarily have any interest in capturing, conquering, and administering Polish territory. And I think people need to get that through their heads. I see no evidence that Putin wants anything to do with Western Ukraine. I mean, he feels compelled to do what he's done in the East. He may ultimately, and I think he probably will, his forces will take all of Eastern Ukraine as a security measure in all probability. But there's no interest in Western Ukraine. If you're a Russian, do you really want to manage lots of Western Ukrainians that hate your guts? That's a very unrewarding exercise. Do the Russians want to manage Poles? Do the Germans want to manage Poles? The answer is no and no. So let's put this 19th century imperialist thinking to bed. Stop talking about Europe as a chessboard. Then let's ask a couple of very key questions. I never hear anybody say this. What do the Ukrainians want? Have they held a referendum in that country? Did everyone stand up and say, yes, we want war with Russia? I would tell you that if you go back to Zelensky's election, when he ran on a peace platform, he was elected overwhelmingly by the population of Ukraine, including not all, but a substantial portion of Western Ukrainians, because they, as well as the Ukrainians in the East, wanted the same thing. They wanted peace. They didn't want revenge. They didn't want a revanchist war to retake Crimea. They wanted peace. Peace is essential to prosperity. So I think we can say safely, no one has really addressed that question. What is in the interest of the people that live in the country? And that applies to Poland. What do the Poles want? Has anybody asked them? You've got a government right now that is extraordinarily hostile to Russia and seems hell-bent for some sort of confrontation. That's catastrophic in my view, and it's unnecessary. So what do the Poles want? Somewhere along the line, people have to ask that question, and the Poles need to answer. So do the Ukrainians. It's a little late for Ukraine, tragically, as we know. There may be only 18 to 22 million Ukrainians left in the country at this point, and everyone who's come out says they will never go back. It's tragic. I don't know that Ukraine will even exist as a nation state when this is over, regardless of what peace arrangements are made. Who knows? But we don't want that fate to befall Poland. So I hope that someone in Poland will stand up and say, what do the Polish people want? Let's find out. Maybe they don't like the answer, but I suspect it will be peace and prosperity, not war with Russia.